rather excitedly and say, Dr. Ellis, look what I found. And they hand me a bone they found on the beach. And I love it. It's terrific. But every single time I've had to say, that's great. It's a chicken wing. Go wash your hands. You found someone's dinner left over on the beach. So it's a really serious question of determining between animal and human bone. From there, the MNI, which stands for minimum number of individuals, it's a way of counting skeletal elements to see how many people are possibly represented. So if I have a box of bones and I can't tell how many skeletons are there, I'll pick one skeletal element from one side, like the left humerus, and count all of the left humeri. That will give me a minimum. If there are 3, I have at least 3 people in that box. I may have more than 3, if not everyone's arms are represented, but it's that basic count. After that, we collect demographic information, age at death, sex, ancestry, not quite the same as race. You can't see race in a skull, but you can get some indication of deep time geographical ancestry. And then the fun stuff. What can we learn about the person's life? What diseases did they have? What did they eat? What trauma did they suffer? And in some cases, the end goal is to get that individual identification, a name. Other times that's not possible, and we're just interested in collecting the information to tell stories about life in the past. And I do, in fact, think that that is sort of my main goal in my work, which is to tell stories and to contribute to our understanding of history in that fashion. One of the main stories I've been telling for a little over a decade now is the story of the Spring Street Presbyterian Church. This was a radical abolitionist church in Lower Manhattan, in what is now Soho today, that was in existence from the early 1800s into the early 1900s and had burial vaults associated with it from about 1820 to 1850. In the early 1900s, the building burned down and it became a parking lot. And in 2006, a construction project on that parking lot to build a new building dug down underneath the blacktop and hit 4 underground burial vaults that had been associated with the church. These were brick and limestone rooms that had stacked wooden coffins in them at the time. So archaeological investigation pulled out about 200 bodies. We know from the death records that we subsequently found there were about 600 people who were likely buried at one time or another at that church. And my work has been looking at those skeletons of early urbanization in New York City to think about how individuals lived, and specifically about what it was like to be a child at that time. What was it like to grow up? What did infants experience, or toddlers, or teenagers? And how can we look at the historic record, written documents, diaries, letters from the pastors, and combine that with the skeletal evidence to, again, tell compelling stories about the past and about the everyday people who were making up life in the city at this time period. So I'm pleased to say my book came out last year on this subject. The remains were reburied in 2014, but there is still a mountain of data that those of us who work with this collection are working through. So there's much more still to come about this Spring Street Church. Here at FAU, our own skeletal collections are also very interesting. We have, as I mentioned, a large collection of native prehistoric remains. And one of the things that I've been working on is, along with some of our students, is getting us into compliance with federal standards for native remains. In 1990, a law was passed, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that mandated that federally funded institutions provide inventories of their native remains to native tribes for them to work with, or for the remains to be repatriated if requested. This was to correct an historical wrong where oftentimes Native American remains were collected as objects of scientific curiosity as versus remains of other groups in this country who would have been treated as family members or ancestors. FAU participated in this, as they had to, in the 1990s, but a couple things happened since the initial participation. Some new collections were discovered within our collections. The law changed in the early 2000s, and so we need to update our compliance with this program. And in 2018, we became aware that we were a little bit behind and began this process. And so it's been a very interesting and very educational experience for me, and also for our students. I have one master's student who completed a thesis on this project, and a number of undergraduate and other graduate students who have volunteered. And what it's done for all of us is give us a chance to think about the ethical side of working with human skeletal remains and of the importance of working with local communities. Right now we are talking to the Seminole and several other tribes who might be interested in cultural affiliation with some of our collections. It's an ongoing process, and it's been a really pleasant one, really collaborative and really interesting. It was new for me, it's new for our students here at FAU, and I think we're all getting a lot out of this experience. The other thing that turned up in our collections when I was going through them were two very badly preserved and damaged skeletons that were designated as, on the box they were in, Victim 1 and 2, 1928 Hurricane Belle Glade. Now, I'm originally from New York. I don't know anything about hurricanes, especially not this relatively not discussed 1928 hurricane. But I've started looking into it because it's a very interesting project. And for those of you who are not familiar, in 1928, a hurricane swept up through South Florida and had a huge impact on Lake Okeechobee. It, in the course of one night, overturned the banks and the dikes that were there and flooded the communities you see circled in blue, including Belle Glade down there in the south. And about 2,000 people drowned. That's an estimated number. We don't actually know the full title. If you read Their Eyes Were Watching God, that book recounts this particular hurricane. And so these two skeletons are labeled as having come from this region. I specialize in time periods with historic records, but this is the most recent that I've worked in. And it's very interesting because we have all kinds of evidence still remaining from this hurricane. So we have photographs that were taken of the damage right after the fact, including photographs like this one, which it's a little bit hard to see, but this is, you see all the white in there? These are, according to the record, bodies that were covered with lime or lye to prevent smell during decomposition after the hurricane. What happened was, this was a fairly recently settled area, farmland, and it was primarily done by people who moved into the area in the 19-teens and early 1920s. A lot of the population were migrant black farm workers, which is part of why we don't know how many people died, because we don't know who was there to begin with. After the flooding and the hurricane, those individuals who were white, who were primarily the landowners, were, for the most part, put into coffins, those who died, and shipped out to the coast back near us for burial. Because folks don't bury in the Belle Glade region, the water table is too high. The bodies don't stay underground. The bodies of the migrant black farm workers were either shipped to two mass grave sites. There's one in West Palm Beach and there's one in Port Mayaca, or they were burned in the fields. And so there's a real component of race involved in studying remains that come out of this region. Now, as to the two skeletons themselves, how do we know for sure that they are actually from this hurricane? We don't. The story, as far as I can tell, is that a farmer found these remains in his field and turned them over to the Lawrence E. Will Museum of the Glades. And it's common, I've been told, by historians and those who work in the area, that if you find bodies in the Belle Glade region that are not native prehistoric, they are labeled hurricane victims. Because again, bodies aren't typically buried out there. And so that is how they came to be associated with the storm. There were some artifacts with them, including some plastic coat buttons and some shoe heels, nondescript, so you can't get a good date on them, but contemporary to the 1920s. You can see here some quickly taken cell phone pictures of the skeletons. This is all of the material that I have right now. And this new project that I'm working on is thinking about these bodies as both evidence of the hurricane, but also as objects that have come to be associated with the hurricane simply because of where they were found. So this is a new project thinking about landscape and memory and race and biology and how it all comes together in these two individuals who, from a skeletal perspective, most bioarchaeologists wouldn't spend any time looking at. There's just not enough of them left. But they remain as a symbol and an object that is really importantly associated with a very recent historic event. And as part of this work, I'm partnering with a community group in West Palm Beach that works to preserve the mass grave there and is hoping to actually build a museum to the hurricane event and a hurricane shelter associated with the museum. So it's this really sort of wide-ranging project in thinking about how bodies contribute to stories about the past. And with that, I think I've probably hit my 10 minutes, so I will stop and pass the mic over to our other speaker. Thanks for listening.